everyone. Welcome to Bachjes, the first launch episode. We are very excited for this. Bachjes is a youth-led initiative seeking to explore history. And what united us was our common dissatisfaction about history. So that's why we are here today. If you like what we do, don't hesitate to contact us to get involved. And we are very excited to announce also that our second episode will be on the 16th of October at the Xarkis Festival in the morning. It's a Saturday. And the theme of the festival is Back to the Roots, Society and Ecology. We will host Elena Parpa and her current research on public gardens in colonial Cyprus. And the title is Identity in the Garden, the case of the Nicosia Municipal Garden, which some of us may know it as Parkon Irinis, next to Paphos Gate. Thank you so much. Stay tuned, follow us on social media to find out about our next events. And I will pass the floor to Maria Georgiou, which will be the facilitator for today's webinar. Maria, you are mute.
Thank you, Lambro. Hello, everyone. So the title of today's webinar is what do history school books do? Reading between the lines and behind the pictures. We wanted to start with a topic that does not discuss history per se, but discusses history through its aims and uses. So the title, what do the books do? By that, we wanted to explore what do the books convey, what narratives do they create? So what is between the lines and the pictures? It is with great pleasure that I would like to introduce our guests, Professor Yannis Papadakis and PhD candidate Miria Konstantinidou, who will help us answer this question today. So the format, as you might have understood, is we have a panel. I'll be the discussant. So we'll give each of our guests 15 minutes. Then there will be a response from me, and we'll take questions. We'll try to take as many questions as possible. And before we go to our guests, I would like to introduce them to you. So I will start from Miria Konstantinidou. She's a graduate of the Pedagogical Department of Primary Education of the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki with a master's degree in Language and Cultural Education from the same university. She also has a master in Education Sciences in Intercultural Education and Psychology from the University of Cyprus. After a scholarship, she attended a postgraduate program in curriculum from Frederick University. She's now a PhD candidate in the University of West Macedonia, where she does her research on visual representation and collective historical memory. She's working as a teacher at the Cypriot Ministry of Education and Culture. Professor Yannis Papadakis, it would take ages to read through his CV, and I don't know to what degree it would be fruitful to do so. So I will give a small summary. So Professor Yannis Papadakis at the University of Cyprus is a social anthropologist. He might be best known for his work Echoes from the Dead Zone of 2005, but he has done work on many areas. He worked on the politics of memory and forgetting, on place and collective identity, on place in relation to collective identity. And he did a project with PRIO on history education in Cyprus. There is a series of articles he wrote after that illustrating the findings on textbooks. And it is in this capacity we have him with us today. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to our guests who will give us a presentation of 15 minutes each on their findings on textbooks in response to the question we set, what do history books do? So Yannis, I give the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Maria. And thank you very much for this wonderful invitation and the chance to be with you today. I'm afraid I have to leave you all around 8 o'clock, but I think this gives us plenty of time. I may want to share some, images. Is that okay, Maria? Can I just do that with share screen? Okay, I take it, that's fine. And let me just say also hello to Miriam, the other speaker. And what I'll try to explain is that, first of all, books tell stories, histories, okay? But I mean stories here in a certain more formal sense, rather than just, in the way that the word narrative is being thrown around about everything, in the news. So they tell stories, and my main inspirations here in this talk are twofold. One is from the work of Hayden White, one of the most important critics of history, who combines literary theory with historical readings, and his books Tropic of Discourse and The Content of the Form. And the second inspiration for this talk is going to be my own kind of readings of cinema. And what I'll try to briefly explain is that the classic stories that histories in Cyprus narrate are more or less like and this is my argument, are more or less like bad Hollywood films, where you have the good guy, the bad guy, etc. And the other history I'll also discuss, which doesn't have a narrative form, is the history of the school books produced in the Turkish Cypriot side in the 2004 to 2009, when the left was in power. That one does not have a narrative form. It's not a proper story. And I hope this will help us understand more what history does. So I'll start sharing a little bit. So here we go. Here is the classic plot: the good, the bad, and the ugly. Which of course is also the title of quite a famous Western, if you're into Western films. Ο καλός, ο κακός και ο άσχημος. And basically the good is of course the self, the national self. The bad is the national enemy. And the ugly, who is the ugly? Usually in both sides, the ugly are the foreign powers, the Western powers that doesn't necessarily side with us fully. And so, we always feel that their role is ambiguous. And let me illustrate this very briefly with just a book cover. Book Good, Bad, Ugly. Protagonist, antagonist. Okay, all stories, stories basically, especially Hollywood stories, they have a protagonist and an antagonist. And immediately we can see the protagonist in the front and the antagonist in the back. Okay, so I love this cover because it's simply so rich. Protagonist in the front, ethnocentric. Okay, the main character of history, antagonist in the back. Keep in mind that this is a combination of images. The images don't exist, so the two images have been put together, okay, to create immediately this effect. Why do they have to be put together? Because it wouldn't be necessarily self-evident that these guys in the front are the good guys. That after all, there are people who seem a bit violent. You need the violence of the antagonist, the enemy, to justify the violence of the national self. Otherwise, the people in the front on their own might simply look violent. Whereas in this combination that, as I said, was put together, the image doesn't exist. This violence is justified. Okay, due to the violent oppressors. Here are the Turks. They look a little bit crazy. They are beheading the priests. And in a way, this tells us everything. Why? Because it's an ethnocentric story, two main characters, and it's a violent story. Okay, war is the motor of history in the same way that violence is also the motor of many Hollywood films. And of course, the most obvious thing that is often missed, these stories are very androcentric. Okay, no women appearing, as central characters. Whereas the Turkish Cypriot school books produced by the left are a little bit like French films. The characters, let's say, evolve, whereas these characters don't evolve. They're the same from beginning to end. And this is how, the classic Hollywood violence stories are. We don't see an evolution in the characters. Whereas in the Turkish Cypriot left-wing history books, the characters change, and also they don't remain the same throughout the narrative. Throughout history, which means that there is no proper narrative and there is no proper conclusion. And let me explain this also more formally now. These are the classic stories that have been reproduced in school books. And these are proper stories, they're proper narratives. They have a beginning and an end. They have a main character, an enemy, and a plot. And basically the self is the same throughout history. Okay, they don't change. In other words, we don't have any notion that identity is constructed and that it changes through history, and that national identity is not the same with pre-national identity. So basically the Greeks, as we know them now, are supposed to exist from beginning to the end of the story. The same in this story. Then the end, of course, if you think about the end, and here I put the notion of the moral center, self, you could say here self, protagonist, moral center, and the enemy, antagonist. Okay, so why do I put here the term moral center? Okay, think of, for example, a fairy tale like the Little Red Riding Hood. Okay, in the end, the wolf is punished. It's more or less cut into pieces by the woodcutter who saves Little Red Riding Hood. And the question here is that a happy end? And it seems self-evident that it's a happy end. But I mean, we could imagine the wolves saying this story in a dark meadow with full moon in the forest, feeling very sad about the unjust end of the wolf. So in other words, what I'm trying to hear is that events are judged from the perspective of the protagonist. If the protagonist is the human, the end is a happy end. If the protagonist is the animal, the end is a sad end. And we identify without even thinking why we identify with a certain group immediately. So these are the classic stories. The characters don't change. Greeks, Turks, they've been there from the beginning of history. Okay, depending on when each side chooses the beginning of the story. And the beginning is very interesting because if you think about it, to the beginning we deny the one quality that all stories, to the beginning we deny the one quality that everything has. And what is the one quality that everything has? Everything has a beginning, apart from the beginning, because the beginning, is the beginning. And I'm saying this just to explain that it's simply a political choice, because you could always take a step back and say what caused this beginning. And so the beginnings are not self-evident in history. So contrast this now with these kinds of history books, and immediately you can see that there is an issue here. No characters, it's just a map And these kind of the stories presented in the Turkish Cypriot school books don't have characters which are there from the beginning of history. Why? Because they explain that national identity is constructed, and it's something that started to be created during the 18th and 19th centuries. So you don't have the nation going back to the very beginning of history. Secondly, they show internal differentiations. Greek Cypriots are not the same, they explain. You know, Eoka was different from the left, and similarly for Turkish Cypriots. The Turkish Cypriots also had, you know, TMT also killed some Turkish Cypriots. And of course, there were different tendencies within the Turkish Cypriot communities. So if you don't have a single character, then you don't have a proper story. And so the story in the end, you know, is kind of left open. So, and I think I'll conclude here. When you have the proper stories, you have a clear conclusion, a good one or a bad one. If it's a good one, you should stay there. Okay, if it's a happy end, you should stay with that. If it's a bad one, then you have to change it. In other words, these are moral stories. They moralize. And whereas this kind of story is not a moral story, and even the symbolism here of the books is a bit, you know, weak in a sense. Because in a way, the story is weak. It's less powerful as a story because it's not a proper story. Things are left open. It's more ambiguous. It's more complex. And that's why I said that this one is like the bad Hollywood films. Two characters, very clear, good, bad. Not you know, they don't change. They're the same from the beginning to end. And they don't evolve. They don't, you know, there's no change in these characters. And of course, this has other ramifications. If somebody did something to the Greeks, I don't know, 500 years ago, it's as if it's done to us now because the character is the same. The same applies, you know, to the character of the Turks in this story. And my main point with which I'll end is that these stories may be more, let's say, these kind of stories may be more rounded. They are less ethnocentric. They try to take into account historical change. They try to take into account different personas within each community. But they are also less powerful as stories. In other words, most people like Hollywood films. They don't like French films, which are more complicated. You have to reflect, and they leave things more open. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yannis. Thank you very much. We'll go on to Media, and then we'll have the discussion and the Q&A all together. So, Media, I give the floor to you.
Okay, Maria, let me share my screen. Are you able to see my? Okay. So let's talk about gender identities through visual representations. This presentation will focus on the visual narratives and representations of women, which may be identified in the Greek Cypriot history textbooks used in primary education. Visual representations, sources and narrative involving women or femininity that can be found in the textbooks were collected and analyzed. Information about female presence concerning material, professional, metaphysical, religious, economic, social life, ritual status were extracted from visual sources through the two textbooks. The term extensively used to refer to visual storytelling in recent times is visual narratives, a term which is applied in a generic sense to denote anything from an illustrated storybook to motion pictures. Visualization may have power to affect, but it can also have a trapping filthy to traditions, both real and imagined. Is there a pattern or motives that are repeated in Greek Cypriot history textbook related to patriarchal schemes about historically authentic sexism in pictures and visual representations? Are there visual female figures identified with the specific historical periods and practices, or issues arise about unequal gender roles, sexist or demeaning parameters of represent femininity, create specific gender identities, or even encompass gauge of oppressive gender roles on women? Textbooks, and specifically the textbooks of local Greek Cypriot history, were selected to be the subject of this examination because, at least for the Greek Cypriot education system, the basic learning tool for education content is and the formal curriculum requires is the formal textbooks. Textbooks are the main vectors of the prevailing social and cultural values in education, especially as carriers of perception about socially acceptable forms of femininity and masculinity and gender roles of a specific socio-political environment. Official textbooks reflect the aspiration and purpose of the dominant discourse chosen to adopt in order to embrace. In the modern era, studies that focus on topics related to gender issues have increased significantly in regard to feminist politics, specialized historical studies of women, and analysis of gender in the production of knowledge. In the international gender studies, the area of observation in the education system and examine our major school textbooks, and which were a key area for investigation about gender issues and parameters. The patriarchal structure of knowledge, which tends from a female presence and the specification of their experience, is reflected both in the curriculum and the textbooks. Recent results have shown globally that in the school history textbooks, the emphasis is focused on military events, politics, diplomacy, trading relationships, or economy. The feminist analysis and the review of literacy, art, social science, medicine, textbooks, and the discourse developed within those frames have revealed and highlight the significant extent in which the above fields have temporal adopt and skew uncertain estimates and bias on gender issues. Additional to the above, modern research and the rhetoric that develops explores gender identities not only as elements of personality, but rather as factors that significantly affect the distribution of roles within the acceptable from any social context, social structures. Gender identities are a multidimensional phenomenon with historical and social extensions. In history textbooks, the women experiences, achievements, successes, or contributions are excluded from the gaze and the interest from the historians, and the activity of women in areas of domestic work and care or active participation in law and grading work, which allowed the participation and the involvement of men in public life, is suppressed and concealed. I just give a little bit of theoretical templates, and I shall move to the books themselves. The content of study are actually 4 textbooks. For the 5th and 6th grade, the history of Cyprus is the oldest one. For the 4th grade, the textbook we are using currently from the Kipro-Geometriki to Kipro-Hellenistiki stage. And from the 3rd grade, My History is Our Story, Our Stories. And the oldest books from stone to clay and from clay to metal. The visual representation and narratives were divided in 2 main categories: photographs, including photographs of primary source material, such as artgraphs, paintings, documents, photo of documents, and buildings, modern sketches and reconstruction. And each category was further subdivided into images shown both sexes, those which feature males, those which only show females, and those with no people, or where, as in certain crowded scene, it's difficult to determine whether the figure is male or female. The presentation of the textbook will follow a chronological order. The oldest book is The History of Cyprus for the 5th and 6th grades, which was first published in 1989 and still in use. It was written by Andreas Polidorou, and the major trends of Cypriot society and education system of the correspondent period. The book has not been replaced yet, and in the specific textbook, only 8 representations of women and femininity can be found in a total image number of 98, where there are 28 men. The unequal representation of women involves the Tiziano painting of Ekaterina Cornaro, a sketch of Saint Constantinos and his mother, Saint Helen, three mosaics where the women are placed in the background, the Theseus mosaic with Ariadne and Dionysus with Acme and Madonna of the Angeloctistic Church at Ketio. A nativity mural is also included in the school textbook, and a statue of Aphrodite. There is also a picture of a female teacher, a very young female teacher, who teaches in a tent after the Turkish invasion. The presence of female is silent, and they are excluded from the social, political, professional, religious aspect and parameters. The lack of references to women's work and the fact that they are entirely absent from the social field and active citizenship. What appears to be more problematic is the fact that even in the few references, the references of women, they do not exist by themselves, but there are the wives, the mothers, the mistress of men. Even in the paradigms where women depict autonomously, the representation selection remains problematic because the picture of Ekaterina Cornaro represents a female with power, she's a queen, and the female teacher represents a traumatic period from the Greek Cypriot history. So she may represent and exist during the ethics of care, considered to be a synonymous with femininity, care, and concealing trauma. The presence of women is silenced, they are excluded from every aspect. The lack of representation and the absence from every sphere appears to be very problematic because they do not exist for a period that covers approximately 1,000 years of history. That book covers the era from 146 BC until the 1960. We're moving to newer books for the 3rd and 4th grade, From Stone to Clay and From Clay to Metal for the 3rd grade. Those textbooks were created during 2001, and they are referring for smaller grades. The visual presentations in the specific textbooks are mainly illustrated sketches, similar to the comics illustrations. Ambulance photographic material also encapsulate mainly associated with archaeological sites as Chirokitia or Engomi. In the 3rd grade textbooks, From Stone to Clay, we can find 63 women representations and 92 in the history from clay to May. 29 references to women are enumerated for the 4th grade books from Kipro-geometrical era to Kipro-Hellenistic era. Although in the later subsequent books, the number of representations regarding the female presence appears to be increased, the attentive study of the visual representation selected to include it in history texts reveals important parameters and mechanisms that attempt to construct and substance femininity and its tropes and practices. From a total number of pictures, the majority of the representations has to do with Myrto, the care narrator of the books, with Stephanos, the boy narrator, who introduced and exhibit students to the periods from the Stone to the Bronze Age. Myrto introduces topics related to articrafts, child care, household care, while Stephanos introduced in subjects related to mobility of population, tools construction, colonization, copper mining. Despite the frequent presence of Myrto, her presence in no way connects with the historical representation of women. It's simply an attempt by the illustrator to include both genders of students rather than restore the active participation and involvement of women in history generally, and especially the history of Cyprus. The fourth grade history textbook, which adopts the same ideology with those in third, has a far fewer representations of women, since the care narrative does not exist at all. An ideal observation in the books of the third and fourth grades records men as gardeners, hunters, fishermen, farmers, builders, owners, breeders, warriors, builders, kings, goldsmiths, to engage in finance, transaction, traders, active participants of citizenship and governance, to be religious leaders and magicians, while women's role is limited to being men's spectators, mothers, to produce clothes, process foods, while acting to male occupation, as in the case of women who are placed on the background as in a smaller scale that men reap and gather goods. In the fourth grade book, where only the 7.3% of the total image number involve women, women were excluded from almost all depictions treated, except those with noble women observed jewelry and fabrics. Despite extensive references to governance systems, no woman presented to participate, along with all reference to war events. During the Archaic era, only one reference can be found, a Corin, female core statue, practically that repeated, and during the classical period, where the female presence that can be found in the textbook is only indicated by the two busts of Venus. The one also is manufactured by a man. Women who can actively appear to participate in social life and ritual, for example, symposia, are concubines and flute-playing girls and servants. Moreover, the images are conservative and written, since the female breast, male subject of pretension, claim, and imagination, always remain covered unless the female is breastfeeding. In illustration, women are placed at the background with reduced size, and the colors used are not as bright as those that used on men. Commonly, the females are placed in the right side of the picture in a percentage almost 85%, since the gaze of the majority of the population, whom are right-handed, focus on the left part of the page. All women are white, even those who appear to be harbor or slaves or live in captivity. Concealment of the diversity of women's groups in color, ancestry, religious beliefs, deprive students' awareness of pluralism, multidimensional female presence, mechanisms stereotypically underestimated and depraved. The female presence become manifest at visual representations. We have moved now to the newest book, My Story, My Stories, Our Story, Our Stories, that was newly published during the school year 2012-2013. The particular textbook was written based on the principle of the new curriculum that was created in Cyprus elementary education those years. But how the objectives were interpreted and transferred in the new textbooks referring to women, femininity, and gender identities. In contrast to the earlier books, the particularly textbooks barely include sketches, artworks, or illustrations taken from the previous school books. The majority of the visual material, which occupies almost the majority of the pages, associate authentic photographs, the result of historical research and methods and practices, and includes primary and secondary historical sources, weapons, jewelry, statues. In particular, the new history textbooks, there are no children guides, Boys or Girl or Myrto or Stephanos. They are just sporadically tiny children pictures, boys or girls in the same numbers, even children with disabilities. From the total of 263 representation, only 2 are direct references to women, the Hadza woman, for example, where we can find 18 direct references for men. The photos associated with male presence has to do with scientists, biologists, drivers, and the photos of mobility, transportation, and political issues and context. One can reasonably assume that it's not possible to identify significant changes in the way the women or femininity is represented. Although the number of the direct visual material presenting women and femininity is limited, significant differences and displacements can be detected. The emphasis on visual presentations chosen to be placed in the specific textbook was given to their use as a tool for developing students' reflection and critical thinking. The majority of the representations function as sources of reflection. Systematic attempt identified in order to avoid presence of gender characteristics that relate to social, professional, economic, religious approach to the presentation of primary and secondary.
Miriam,
Yes?
sorry, I need to ask you to wrap up. I'm sorry.
I shall finish in 1 minute.
But I'm conscious of the time. So
Okay.
you could wrap up so as to.
Okay, I shall sum up. Okay.
Thank you.
We can argue that the new history textbook is more fair to men and women. But it's also problematic in the fact that in the total number of textbooks systematically ignore the female figures that traditionally and historically have connected to the Cypriot history and mythology, Aphrodite, Madonna, or Regina. The references are absent, or if they can locate as sporadically and fragmentary. This has not detected formal behavior patterns that promote bravery, skillful political views, business assumes historical achievements, and so on. So, according to the previous, in Greek Cypriot textbooks, the position of women is eliminated, and it's still significant to remove from sex-linked stereotypical individuals in specific roles and orientations. The new national curriculum history, which emphasizes the development of historical skills and cannot be divorced from historical knowledge, thus provide opportunities for the inclusion of the history and experiences of women who have traditionally been underrepresented within historical record. These opportunities need to be identified and exploited to achieve a more gender balanced history knowledge. That's from me. I apologize for my pronunciation. Thank you.
Thank you, Miriam. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I had to interrupt you. Thank you.
No, you did well because I speak a lot. So
We always get carried away when we talk about our research and we get excited. So yes, I know how it is. So before we move into the discussion and like bringing the two presentations together to bring out the bigger picture and answer, go to the presentation, say in combination with textbooks do. I would like to take a couple of questions, however, very briefly, on the specific presentations. So if you have a question about something specific from the presentations, please write it down. I see here a question from Evrenzel Sepep for Yannis Papadakis. You have mentioned the importance of the beginnings of the history school books, how the books from different communities start their story from different periods, and how this shows beginnings are not self-evident in history. Could you explain a bit more why do you think beginnings are so important?
Thank you, Maria. And thank you, Evrenzel. There's also another question by Lambros that came before that. Very briefly, if history education is not to get ethnocentric, how should it be? Should people strive for a common history? And why not? So maybe I'll start from Andros and then go on to Evrenzel. The Republic of Cyprus has signed some of the principles of the Council of Europe for history education. And I'll briefly mention this. It says history should have a role in reconciliation, recognition, understanding, and trust among people, promote fundamental values like tolerance, mutual understanding, help students analyze, interpret in a critical way based on a multi-perspectival viewpoint, and it should not be a means of ideological propaganda and promote hate, nationalist, xenophobic, racist ideas. And both history textbooks of both sides, of course, you know, they are the last, they promote everything that the Council of Europe says that shouldn't be promoted. So basically what I would say to Lambros is that maybe we should just focus on principles. I am also a little bit concerned, I'm concerned both about the idea of a common history and also about the idea of a history which teaches, I don't know, values related to peace. And this may sound a bit strange. I'm opposed to the notion of, let's say, a common narrative, because I think that we should talk more on the level of methodology rather than on the level of content. So I think we should strive more for, I don't know, critical perspectives in history and multi-perspectivity, rather than necessarily create another story, which is then imposed on the students, even a story based on principles of peace, etc. Because again, it's another imposition of an older generation on a newer generation. Maybe we should just teach principles and methodologies and let students decide what they're interested in, what kind of histories they're interested in, and look into them. And let's not forget that, you know, education, maybe one of the best sides of both educational systems is that they fail abysmally. They really don't teach anything to students, I think, at the end of the day. And this is my experience as a teacher. And I mean, at university level. And let's not forget that, you know, the way that people today approach everything is simply one word, you know, Google. So, I mean, maybe let's help students understand sources, evaluate sources, compare sources, etc. So this is the level at which I would respond to Lambros. Now, in terms of Evrenzel, there is this issue of beginnings. I came first. I was before you. Do you see what I mean? I was here before. This is mine, etc. So beginnings are important, often in the sense of, you know, like having a title deed. You know, this is mine because I came first. but what I was trying to show is that beginnings are so political. In other words, I mean, the Greek Cypriots start from the ancient Greeks coming to Cyprus. The Turkish Cypriots, they start from the Ottomans. I mean, it's so obvious that they're just so political. And yeah, so basically I'm trying to subvert the very notion of a beginning in any sense. Thank you.
I would like to build on Evrenzel's point about the beginnings and go back to something that Yannis mentioned, the 18th and the 19th century. And I think we need to put textbooks into the context of nation building if we want to talk about beginnings. So we have the beginning of the nation state and the textbook. History education in general and the books specifically are used as tools for building an identity. Now, the fascinating thing is that the nation states were an outcome of modernity, the Enlightenment, that wanted to break out from hierarchies and authority, such as the kings and the church. So now we are imagining a nation where we are all equal. We mentioned again in another of this series webinars about the imagining the nation in Anderson's words as a deep horizontal comradeship, which means that we are all the same. This is how the nation was imagined. Yet the textbooks we've seen by both presentations create hierarchies, the same hierarchies that the idea of the nation building aspire to break down. We have hierarchies, we have dichotomies, we have set roles, as we've seen from both. What I wanted to tease out at this point is, and I think this goes back to Lambros's question in a sense, on how we should teach history. We have monolithic identities. So the people that are narrated in the books are only one thing. So they are either Greek Cypriot or Cypriot, and usually by Cypriot in the Greek Cypriot side, we mean Greek, or they are just men, or they are just women. So people don't have they are not shown the complexity of their identities. I mean, today it's very fashionable, we talk about intersectionality, but nowhere in our books, people are seen as a multidimensional entity. And I think this is a response to Lambros on how we could teach. We could teach social history, we could teach cultural history. I wanted to ask our two guests on whether they could say a bit more on this, how the textbooks create this monolithic and at the same time stereotypical identities. Miria, would you like to go first?
Yes, I believe that according to women and their absence from the political scene, from the religious rituals, from their absence creates a gaze that leads to students to believe that it is okay for the women or that team of population to be excluded. So for picture, it's easier to include more representation, or as the example of the newer books, that the pictures that were placed inside are photographs, are sources that are not directly leads to men or women, but to humanity that used those tools to create art, to create building, to create life. So we can use an approach that shows the participation of the population, okay, the hegemonic population of the specific era to create things, and also give voice to those that are not represented, the minorities, the women, the slaves. And if we try to approach critical thinking during history lessons, not just for women or subjects that are usually silenced during history lessons, it will be easier to work with new approaches to include a multi-layered approach that includes everyone. It's not easy to create it, but if we try to speak to the students about that, the one that decides what the picture shows is the one that can see the picture or can read the textbook, and according not only to their prior knowledge, but to everything that comes around them, internet, newspapers, and try to think and criticize what they read or what they see. That's the first and the major step for creating historically thinking students.
Thank
To
you.
give space and speech to those that do not have representation in the textbooks, and try to help our students to, it's very easy to say, but very hard to achieve it. And try to help our students to think critically when they are thinking historically.
So in a few words, I think what you are saying is that in order to move away from set and monolithic and stereotypical identities,
Yes.
we want to take into account, we need to discuss marginalized identities as well, not just women, but all identities that are marginalized, and also do it in a critical way, in critical thinking.
Yes, exactly.
Thank you. Yannis?
Well, I think I would go a couple of steps beyond, in the sense that I think that books in themselves are outdated. I don't think young people read books. In fact, there's good arguments that series can create many different perspectives. You can explore characters deeply. I'm not sure if there is any justification even for literature vis-a-vis television series. But so I think that books, the notion of a book in itself is, I think, not so useful. And going back to the notions of identity, of course, yeah, these books create identity. The Turkish Cypriot left-wing books leave identity more open as an issue. The other ones, clearly try to impose identities. But we could even already, we are discussing always within the bounds of the national. Why should we have national history in the first place? There are other societies like the Scandinavians, for example, that have a book called History, which is a global history, and then you have inserts in the book where Sweden comes in. And imagine what a different perspective that gives to students, rather than our histories, which we take for granted that they have to be national histories. Or imagine if we were taught Mediterranean history. I mean, how different perspective that would give us on the past. And of course, the bigger question then is if our society is more history-centric. Are there societies that are more history-centric and others which are more present-centric? And I think societies which deal with problems like ours, which are still wounds, traumas, tend to be more history-centric rather than other societies which don't deal with these kinds of issues. And so maybe we should even start thinking beyond books and even beyond the notion of identity, in the sense that if you produce a Cypriot-centric book, that's again an imposition of another identity. And of course, that creates other kinds of exclusions, migrants, you see what I mean? Because again, it's you know, a certain imposition of a certain close, let's say, boundary of identity, which doesn't actually leave options for change. And I mean, my last point, and this is very much an anthropological point, if we see at how people like Foucault use history, or what is the historian that wrote that wonderful book, The Past is a Foreign Country? Lowenthal discussed history. That's an interesting way of thinking about history. The past is a foreign country. It's in the past, and it's elsewhere. And this this allows us to use history in a way of as a defamiliarizing device, in the same way that we use anthropology. In other words, what Foucault, for example, does, he shows that the things that we take for granted, sexuality, in the individual self, are historical constructs, which helps us then defamiliarize categories that we take for granted, that we consider could not be otherwise. So, I mean, there is also space for these kinds of uses of history, as in this, which work exactly in the same way as anthropology does, as defamiliarizing devices, which help us question our most taken for granted assumptions.
Thank you, Yannis. Just something I would like to add on the point of our society being historiocentric. I think one of the issues, the problems we face in history is that we take for history things that are not necessarily history. So, for example, White draws the distinction of practical history. Practical history is what we see around us or what we hear around us. For example, oral history. The thing is that much of those things are memory, are collective memory, and there is a line to be drawn. So I think one of the problems we have is that we haven't made a discussion, an honest discussion about history. At times it feels for me that in Cyprus, we have more memory than history, and we refuse to engage with what is history. I mean, for obvious reasons, there is a political problem and so on. Yeah, but I think it's important to keep in mind that what we often say, yes, but it's our history, we need to discuss it, and that's why we are historiocentric. No, many of the things we call history are not necessarily history. Yanni, I'm very aware of the time. I realize you might have to go. Do you have a time for a last question?
Maria, instead of the last question, I'd like to just leave you with one point and then with 2 points, if I may.
Yes, please.
I'll say what you said before in a very different way, though. In a sense, in Cyprus, there is no history because everything is in the past, in the present. Nothing is in the past as in done and finished with. And this has to do with traumas. In other words, we consider important who came to Cyprus, I don't know, 2,000 years ago, who came to Cyprus 600 years ago. In other words, these are so important for the present. And in a sense, in Cyprus, there is no past. Everything is in the present. Everything matters for now in the way that history works. And my last point is about the historian that also Miriam mentioned, Polidorou. I had an amazing exchange with him live on television, which I would like to share with you, and you can post it. And basically what he's saying, Miriam, is that he's actually now very ashamed of his book, of the book that he wrote. And I found that very moving and very inspiring that a historian would say that about his own work, that he's kind of ashamed, but the book is not his anymore, and he cannot withdraw it in any way. And I'll send this clip to Maria, and she can upload it. Because, you know, even the historian who wrote this book says that, you know, and I mean, for me, he's quite an inspiration in the sense that all of us are caught up. He explains how he was caught up in the period when he wrote it, okay? And that, of course, made him write it in a certain way, that he had to support the national spirit του εθνικό φρόνημα. And it's amazing that he acknowledges this and he now critiques his own work. And I'm just saying this because in a way all of us are caught up in our own presence. And for me, Polydoro is also an inspiration of somebody who, you know, comes and says, you know, looking back, you know, yes, there are issues with you know, the way I wrote in the past. So thank you very much, Paul. Thank you for inviting me. I'm sorry I cannot stay longer.
Thank you.
Maybe I'll join you another occasion. Miriam, thank you very much for your interesting.
Thank you, Mr.
Okay.
Papadakis. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was indeed a pleasure.
It's a sure sign of age if you call other people by first name and they call you with their last name.
No.
So bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
I would like to continue the conversation on what Yannis said about thinking about the past. But before I do so, I see some questions here.
Yes.
I would like to go to the chat. Before I go to the chat, I would like to ask Maria Constantinidou to write in the chat whether her question has been answered. There is a question. If it's not, so please, Maria, let us know. You can ask your question if it hasn't been answered. Or if you would like Miria to elaborate more. So Desiree has a question for Miria. Desiree, would you like to take the floor and ask your question?
Hi there. So I wrote my question on the chat. I'm just going to read it out if I can find it. Just a minute. Here we go. So yeah, we were talking, well, Miria was talking about the misrepresentation of women and minorities in history textbooks. But I don't think we spoke so much about the misrepresentation of men, which is also a gender issue. And I think, at least in the history textbooks that I was subjected to at school, I think the representation of men often fitted this narrow masculinity that infects most areas of society. So is there any scope for representing men in a more fluid way? And when I say is there any scope, I mean, obviously what we put in history textbooks relies on what we have in terms of research and sources. So I don't know how much it's possible as well, but how could we represent men in a better way also in history textbooks? And is there any efforts towards this at the moment, or is it mostly focused on a better representation of women, which is also a big issue? So yeah, thanks.
Can I ask? Thank you for the question, dear Desiree. Yes, you are correct. The representation of male falls into only defending a narrow masculinity. Very specific schemes, stereotypes is used in the textbooks, not only in the Cyprus case, I believe globally. There is not enough research done, but after the claims, mostly from the Loatki community, they have raised their voice and they have started a very useful, I believe, dialogue about in what other ways can we represent men also inside history. History is just a parameter, but because the specific community has raised its voice, I believe that in the future, we shall start moving from the stereotypic roles and representation of men, firstly in newer books and later in history textbook, I believe, because history textbooks are the production of governments and the winners in battles, politicals, theoreticals, etc. So they shall follow, but years later. I believe during the social media, the newer books, we shall start seeing new ways of representing men that are caring, that they are sweet, that they have no roles. I believe it's an opportunity to represent men in other ways too. Men are not only warriors, men are not only members of the Latvian community, are multifaceted and they need more ways to represent themselves. That's what I believe. I believe that the future will be better. But I'm very optimistic as a person, so.
We should be optimistic. I mean, if we work in education, we have to be optimistic and we need to push forward. Thank you, Miriam. Thank you, Desiree. I think this fits in, it actually elaborates what the point I was making before about having identities that are monolithic and fixed and set, that they don't allow the multiplicity of an identity of being a man or a woman or being a Cypriot to come out. And I think the discussion that took place right now illustrates that in a very nice way. So Maria Constantinidou, would you like to make your question to Miriam?
Thank you, Maria. My question, let me just rephrase my question essentially. What I noticed from history books, because I'm a history educator, and at higher levels, so not in primary school, but in higher levels, let's say, because I'm teaching at an English school, and we see it's a very similar pattern that we only see women in a chapter about society. And most of the book is about, let's say, politics or economics and so on and so forth. So I'm really concerned about what the history book is going to look like in practical terms, because I'm very interested in this topic. And I know it's kind of a challenging question to answer, but for a book that is not necessarily gender related, so it's not just gender history, in, let's say, the typical primary school narrative, how is gender going to be played out, let's say, in a history book in primary school?
Actually, thank you for the question, Maria. Actually, that is represented in the book is the reality of the women during those eras. The women in previous periods were mainly excluded from the political stage or from many rituals. So we must, before we teach, we need to prepare and talk with our students about that. It's not the 21st century. Years ago, the reality was that the women role was that, but that does not mean that they will not contribute in the economy in that ways, in the art, in those ways. We shall, I believe, in a more practical way. That's what I have understood your question, how we practically include women in history. Firstly, we must point out that we study each period according to also their realities. So it was the reality of those times that the women were excluded from the social stage. And after we point out that, we are trying to say, yes, the men were doing that, but also, you know, when the men were at the war, someone must stood for the economy, the fields, the jewelries, the ways the women try and manage to continue the socio-economical life in those times, the art of those times, the literature art they could produce. For example, for the Greek Revolution of 1821, we only know about Bouboulina and Manto Mavrogenous, but the most of us do not know which Domna Visvisi is, for example. We shall try to find ways to include women in history in the official textbooks. The major issue with textbooks is that they follow years after the communities try to speak about their rights, and they represented 20 years after the voices are raised. So when those books will be written, it will be, as Mr. Papagiannis said before, it will be also a bit late and a bit problematic, because today's children are used with internet, social media, libraries, and they're so easy for them to try and search for what they want or need. So we must try to help them see that the whole population was included in the historical periods.
I'm very tempted to, I'm just going to throw it out there, not to discuss it today, because I'm certain we'll have many opportunities to discuss this in Barthes, but except from the fact that it has never been shown how women contributed to society, it has never been shown how women have suffered because of men, because it's the men that take the decisions. So we have this silencing, the silencing of women takes place at many levels, not just one. It's not just their contribution has been silenced, it's their experience of suffering. And here in Cyprus, women, for example, have suffered a lot because of the war, of the conflict. So
yes,
just
but they are also used because of the war.
Yes.
The only representation we have as a society about the war that is referring to women are the statues of mothers of the soldiers or the missing persons. So the state itself used the women to represent trauma and pain and suffering. So it's more multidimensional, the way even the state has treated to women and their sufferings, not just in Cyprus, I believe globally, with poverty in countries, in other countries, and in Cyprus also, how they used those images to claim other rights that has nothing to do with women or femininity, but they were also a tool for them to use. Sorry, Maria, for interrupting you.
Exactly. And for example, we know now that because of COVID, it is women that have been affected the most, yet it is not always obvious. So I'm certain we'll have the opportunity to discuss this further in Barthes. I'm very conscious of the time. So before I go to a last question on the bigger picture, what do the books do? I would like to read from the chat. There has been an interesting conversation here between Alyosha, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this right, saying that Alyosha, who I believe now has left, saying that very often they say that teachers very often say that it's not practical to teach critical thinking or skills, or is difficult. And I think there is a brilliant response below from Lucas Pericleus, we know from research that not only it's possible if we teach children from a younger age, it's much more fruitful. It can have a much bigger impact. So I think one of the mythologies we need to break away from is what children, students are able to understand and confront and work with. There is enough evidence to know that students older and younger can work with complexity and with skills and with questions and with sources, and we should stop hiding behind that excuse for not teaching a better history. So I absolutely I agree here with Lucas. I couldn't have said it better. I've seen that Stefanos here talks about pseudoscience. I don't know, Stephanie, if you are a teacher, an educator. So Peter Lee talks about students bringing to the classroom many misconceptions from their everyday life. So they use things that are happening to their everyday life to explain history. For example, what you've said here, the idea that this is what it has always been like that, and it will always be like that, or it was, there is a specific phrase you use here. So I think that again takes us to the need to teach better history to help students move away from these misconceptions or preconceptions. I don't know if there are any, I'm reading this myself because these are our comments, but if there is a question I've missed, so I don't see any questions. So I would like to go again back to the bigger picture and continue from where Papadakis, Yannis, before he left, he said that we got stuck in the past and we discuss things as they've started, our identities. In this way, we create one teleologies, which means that things have started in a way, and they are going in a way, but they stay the same. So to put it in simple words, Greeks are always the good guys, and Turks are always the bad guys. For example, for us here, Cyprus in the south, or for Greece itself, for the Greek book. So we have this, we are cultivating these identities that are always the same, and the relationship, what Yannis said about the relationships, the good, the bad, and the ugly, this never changes in the books. The relationships are always the same, and this whole narrative, the role play between the identities always moves in the same way that it creates a telos, the end, but we know what it is. It is what it is today, and it was yesterday. So that's one thing that books do. The other one, and I think it was also mentioned, is moralizing. Now, I would like to ask Miria before we leave whether she would like to say something about this, on how we create these identities that are always the same in the pass of time, or how we moralize. And maybe, Miria, if you would like to say something about why is it dangerous to use textbooks and history in general for moralizing?
It's very dangerous, not just for Cyprus. Globally, history textbooks are tools that are used by the government in Cyprus, in Turkey, in Greece, in India, in England, everywhere. History textbooks are written by the winners. In the political era, yes, but are reflecting the aspects of the winners, the aspects of the hegemonical team of each country, and they are trying to establish and give to the students first and then to their citizens later the thought that they are rightful living in those lands on those eras, and they're trying to create not just morals but the feeling of ownerships that okay, we are rightful here. And that's something almost every country tries to do with history and their textbooks. And that's why in the Cyprus case, it's so difficult to change the 5th and 6th grade history textbook for primary education. I was very happy 10 years ago, 12 years ago, when grade teams of academics started writing the new textbooks about the primary education, but I was worrying that the 4th grade will be the ending, because I knew that it will be very, very difficult for them to, they will have to do excellent work, but it will be very difficult for them to pursue the government to left party, right party, center party, which one. It will be very difficult for them to make them accept the fact that they wanted the teenagers to think not only stereotypically monolith that we are correct and everybody else is wrong. And it was not a surprise to me that the efforts of rewriting the books finished not in 4th grade, in 3rd grade. The new book about the 4th grade never landed in the hearts of teachers to try to teach it after 15 years. And Cyprus is not the only case. That's a global phenomenon that while we are moving to the present, it's more difficult to handle traumatic past, to handle that, you know, it's not the good, the bad, and the ugly. The truth is something between the lines. It's not just one. We can have many interpretations. That's very difficult for the governments to handle. I don't know if I covered you.
Yes. In fact, it has been very interesting how the changes that have taken place in the textbooks are much more brave, to put it this way, radical in the younger years when we come to the 5th and the 6th year of the I'm talking about primary school, and secondary school is a totally different thing. So here I'm talking about the primary school. When we come to the 5th and 6th year, it's so difficult to move into changes, because we need to discuss and re-examine the position of the winners, those who have the power within our communities, what they represent, what has been suppressed. It has to and to go back to a point I made previously. In order to do that, we firstly need to have a discussion, a public discussion, and a discussion within historians' history itself about the recent history, about what was it that happened, how we ended up being here, and what has been silenced. And if we don't have this conversation, I think, firstly, in the public domain and within like the discipline of history, and I don't know what should come first, because one reflects the other. Always academia reflects the society, and the society reflects historiography. And I don't know, of course, this is for another webinar, what is the role of the historian? What is our role also as educators to push the discussion? but yes, Emilia, what you said is much more difficult to change things when it comes to issues that matter to us and still affect us. To say that, for example, we've done wrong, we've been wrong. I'm looking at Lambros's comment that we don't have much time left. So if there is a question, please let us know. I've seen that there is some interesting conversation here in the chat. I don't know if we could close with this. So I would like to say a big thank you to everyone who has joined, Miria Konstantinidou and Yannis Papadakis. It was a pleasure to facilitate this and be the discussant. I hope we can have you with us in our future webinars. And now I will pass it on to thank you to all of you who raised questions, who made comments. I hope you enjoyed the webinar, and I hope you will be with us in the next webinar. So now I'm going to pass it to Lambros to wrap up and also give information about our next webinar.
Thank you everyone from me as well again, for joining and listening and participating. So yeah, on 16th of October, we have our next episode, which is going to be hybrid. You can join live at Xarkis Festival or join online. And it's called Nature, Culture, Power, a history of the Nicosia Municipal Garden, which is Parko Irinis, next to Paphos Gate. Thank you so much. You can find information about the Xarkis Festival in our social media too. Take care.